Now, I was a bit flummoxed when I got the, I'm just going to talk. I was a bit flummoxed when I got the invitation because political concepts. My view about words is that all words are political. So I could give a talk about shoe or chair and why it's political. So my last book, The Politics of Language, I argued for that by arguing that what a word is a move in a speech practice, and all speech practices locate you socially, have a history, so all words are political. But I don't have an argument that all concepts are political. I'm a philosopher of language, not a philosopher of mind. So, you could a possible position. I mean, we know that the word reason is gendered. Study after study has shown that people associate reason with agency and rationality, and unreason with emotion, and passivity. But you might say it's just a word and the concept isn't gendered. And I don't really have an argument that all concepts are political, so I will not be presenting on shoe or chair today. Now, what will I be doing? Well, since Christopher Roberts already took the topic of education, I'm going to have to shift slightly. Before I introduce this, I should say something specific about what this is and what I do. I have sort of two lives. One is as an academic, and one is as a political person appearing on television, writing trade books, advising politicians, speaking to labor unions. That's half my life, increasingly more. And I use my academic work to do the foundations of my political work. So but when you're doing political work, you really cannot use theoretical terms. You have to be as basic as possible if you want to speak to people. So what I'm going to be talking about today is my new trade book coming out in September in the teeth of the election, which is called Erasing History: How Fascists Control the Past, Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. And so it's not going to be as theoretical as the other talks. It's going to be theoretical. One of the ways that I adjudicate my trade books, my public work, is how non-theoretical it is in its presentation, and how it conveys to anyone, a high school grad, or, the concepts that need to be conveyed. And in particular, the concepts that I'm interested in conveying are the issue I'm addressing is the attack on history, which is, and not the attack on history, but why people why at moments in time people make attacks on history. And so we're seeing this in the United States. We're seeing this in, we see it everywhere. It's sort of a it's a basic feature of authoritarianism that you do a certain thing with history. And so my book is trying to explain what that thing is. So now, how do I do this? Well, I sort of started off in a way well, first let me show that what's happening here, sort of an easy thing to show, is an attack on history, is an erasure of history. Let's consider the attack on critical race theory. It looks to be an attack on concepts and theories. But take a work of, so one time after my colleague Elizabeth Hinton's book, America on Fire, came out, I called her and said, "Your book is critical race theory." And she was shocked and appalled. She said, "No, it's history." But one of the early chapters in Elizabeth Hinton's book is called The Cycle. And it's about how the last 50 to 70 years in the United States are characterized by this thing where there's an incidence of police violence, there's an uprising or revolution, there's an instance of police violence against a black citizen, then there's a revolution against the police, and then everyone comes in and said, okay, we're going to calm it down, we're going to change the practices, and then everybody calms down, and and they say, okay, we're going to do structural change. And then someone runs for office saying that the people doing structural change are coddling criminals. And then things go back even worse to where they were before. And Hinton describes this process in Cairo, Illinois, in small cities, because Hinton's point is that it's occurring everywhere. It's not just it's not just Rodney King in LA. But the way she approaches this history is describing policing practices and how policing practices don't change and how political practices don't change. And so what she's describing are practices, and practices that maintain racial hierarchies. And the attack on critical race theory is an attack on the concept of structural racism. Structural racism, critical race theory is the study of practices that entrench racial hierarchy. Very clear in Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. So when you say you can't teach critical race theory, you're saying you can't teach Black history. So this is, and then we have to ask, what's the purpose of that? And as will emerge, if I get to it, but I'm going to highlight it right now, the goal is to make white people in America terrified when they see political protest. Because when you remove the understanding of the structures and practices, then it's bewildering why people are protesting. And so you can represent the protest as apolitical, which is, for example, how the British represented Mau Mau. They're reverting back to savagery. So the goal of these erasures of history is to remove the concepts we need to understand uprising social movements. So that's what I'm trying to explain in the most simple possible way in this book. Before Christopher Rufo becomes Secretary of Education. So now the book centers I discuss many cases. Well, not many cases. I focus. Let me say about how I think about political structures like fascism or democracy. So we can talk about fascism or democracy as a way of appointing leaders. We can talk about it as a set of institutions. Fascism has the concentration camp, and we can talk about it as a regime type. We can talk about it as a set of institutions, and we can talk about it as a culture, set of practices and narratives. And it's the latter way that I think about political structures in this work. What is a fascist ideology? What is a colonialist ideology? What is a nationalist ideology? What are different nationalist ideologies? There's multiple versions of nationalism. So what interests me is, so we know from the literature on fascism and colonialism that they're intricately connected constructs. So Césaire, Arendt, Du Bois are all very clear. And I've been reading a lot of Nazi textbooks, because that's the kind of thing I do on a Saturday, and microfilm. And they're really upset about the loss of the German colonies in Africa. It's a central theme of Nazism. Du Bois and Arendt somehow understood this very early on, and I don't think they had microfiche access to Nazi textbooks, but Du Bois already in 1946 in The World in Africa is like, Hitler's mad about the loss of the African colonies. So, and Césaire says, then they went and did that to white people, which is what Hitler did in Eastern Europe. So the book has the first three chapters are colonialism, nationalism, and fascism, where I'm seeking to unpack what we know, that there are these common practices. So that's how I think of something like fascism or colonialism as a set of practices and narratives. Narratives are like the West is civilized, the civilized savagism paradigm, and they interconnect the educational, and I'm interested in the educational practices, but Christopher Roberts stole the term education. But hopefully maybe our presentations will overlap. So I look at, the book is based with the prime example being the United States. The United States' history of internal colonization against its indigenous and black populations. And the themes that I'm discussing are very much theorized in the U.S. black intellectual tradition. So now why in a book on, so the book is called Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Why center the United States in a book like that? Of course, we obviously have a colonialist element to our history, but do we really have a fascist element? Well, from Du Bois to the Soledad Brothers to Angela Davis, the black intellectual tradition regularly uses the term fascism for Jim Crow and other aspects of U.S. institutions like the police, prisons. Is Rikers Island a fascist institution? Fascist institutions, concentration camps are, in Timothy Snyder's words, zones of lawlessness where you can do anything. Is Rikers a zone of lawlessness? So it's not just the black intellectual tradition that labels U.S. practices as Toni Morrison's lecture, obviously Racism and Fascism at Howard, but it's not just this tradition that labels the United States in this way or conceives of the United States this way. Let me read you from Hitler's Mein Kampf. I know that people do not like to hear all this, but anything more thoughtless, more harebrained than our present-day citizenship laws scarcely exists. There is today one state in the world at which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the American Union, in which an effort is made to consult reason, at least partially. By refusing immigration on principle to elements in poor health, by simply excluding certain races from naturalization, it professes in slow beginnings a view which is peculiar to the folkish concept of the state, by which he means a state based on race. So we know from Hitler's second book, where he says, who anymore speaks of the Red Indian, meaning that positively, and his desire to make Ukraine into the antebellum South with large German plantations. And he says, we'll have the Ukrainians work all day, and then we'll just put a radio in the square and they'll dance around a pole because that's what they like to do. So he's clearly seeing, it's unambiguously seeing the United States as a progenitor of the state he wants to construct. And of course, as Jim Whitman's book, 2017 book shows, Hitler's American Model, the Nuremberg laws that removed citizenship from my 3-year-old father and grandparents in Berlin in 1935 was based on the Jim Crow laws, except they decided that 1 drop was too severe, and so they went with 1/8 Jewish. So the United States, as far as I can tell, was kind of a singular racial state and received as such internationally. So, the examples. So I'm trying to figure out this thing that's obvious from history, that's seen clear. Well, from intellectual history, that's seen clearly by the theorists of fascism and colonialism. So what I'm going to do, because I'm very proud of this, because I'm a philosopher, not a historian, I've spent a lot of time with textbooks, and so I'm going to read some of textbook quotes. What's funny is the sort of main examples that I use in the book. I use Ukraine, Russia, the new Russian textbooks for the occupied Ukrainian territories. I use some textbooks from India, BJP textbooks. I use a lot of American textbooks, and Prager U is a very helpful source of fascist narratives. What else? And I use Israel's self-representation, which is very clearly fits all these models. So I'm going to, and my claim is that there's a certain very particular structure to fascist erasures of history, and so I'll get to that. So some of this is going to be just, oh right, another primary example I use is the British colonization of Kenya, and in particular the treatment of the Kikuyu, which is very similar. I taught a course in Ukraine in August, and I'm going back in July. So I taught a 2-week course. I've accepted a permanent position there, visiting position. I taught a 2-week course on colonialism to 300 Ukrainians, where the goal was to present them with literature on European colonization of Africa and U.S. internal colonization, and see what resonated. They loved Ngugi wa Thiong'o because I wouldn't be surprised if there's a statue erected to him because I mean, the distinctive feature of a distinctive feature might be mapped to Pakistan and Bangladesh, but this idea that you're really us. Obviously, the British weren't saying to the Kikuyu, "You're really us," but that's a distinctive feature. I mean, maybe it's not a distinctive feature, but it's a feature of the Russia-Ukraine situation. But otherwise, there's all these connections between Mau, Land and Freedom Army, and how they were treated, how the Kikuyu were treated in the 1950s, and Ukraine. Chapter 3 of Caroline Elkin's book Imperial Reckoning is called Selection, where they were trying to figure out who had Kikuyu identity. Because the idea is, if you had Kikuyu identity, it was like kind of a mental illness. If you had the Kikuyu religion, it was kind of a mental illness. That's a sort of theme throughout colonialism. And so they tortured people to see if they had Kikuyu identity. Well, that's exactly what Russia is doing with their but it's just the term is filtration. So the official line is that Ukrainians are Russian, and if you speak Ukrainian and if you say you're Ukrainian, you have a mental disorder, and you need to be educated out of it. And the form of the education, of course, is not what we traditionally consider education. So it was very resonant to them. The language issue, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o says in his memoir, at Alliance High School, if you were found speaking Kikuyu, you had to wear a sign saying, "I am a donkey," or "I am stupid," for the whole day. So those, and then obviously the representation central to all of these structures is the representation, especially colonialism and fascism, is the representation of colonized groups as having no history. Now, I should say that I'm a little concerned. I'm a little befuddled by the term decolonialism, because there's so many decolonialist movements are thinly veiled nationalist movements, and so I've encountered this in Ukraine, where there's a very public discussion about this, like what will the form take after they beat the Russians? What will the form of the state take? Will it be, will it be a kind of aggressive ethno-nationalist Ukrainianism, or will it be a different version? And this is a very public, salient discussion. I was speaking at the Ukrainian Museum last week with a couple other, with a Ukrainian art historian who has the practice, who is engaged in the virtuous practice of trying to get museums to switch their Russian-labeled artists to Ukrainian, which is even the Met, and so. But there was a lot of Ukrainian national. There was a lot of, it's shared, the kind of history that Fanon is criticizing of like blood ties to the land kind of thing, which is a kind of dangerous nationalism. And of course, India is claiming that anything, that Muslims are colonialists, or that was an imperial conquest, and they're decolonizing India by making Muslims second-class citizens. They're claiming LGBT is a colonial addition, so they're and obviously liberalism, cosmopolitanism. So I'm going to read from some of these textbooks. You're going to notice that the American textbooks are particularly like the textbooks from India on BJP textbooks are much subtler than American textbooks, which are basically like, for like until very recently, slavery. Everyone loved it. It was just very, it's over the top. Even the Nazi textbooks are not like that. They're not so manifestly. So let's see. So I'll begin with these are not, so this is from the section on colonialism. These are not Israeli textbooks. It's just what happened in Israel. So erasing history is central to the Israeli project, the Zionist project. So here's David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. His comments on the Nakba. The War of Independence brought ruin and destruction on hundreds of settlements. And when the state came into being, there stood only the Jewish villages established in the last 70 years, and a few which were not Jewish. The truth is that the state inherited a wasted and deserted land. Obviously, all the anti-colonial literature points this out, that you ruin Lewis and Jane Gordon's book, chapter 2 of Mills's The Racial Contract, empty land. Now, to promote this myth, Israeli forces first drove the inhabitants of Palestinian villages and towns out, then destroyed and removed these villages to the point of removing, like Carthaging them. They didn't salt the earth, but they removed every brick. There's a somewhere between the estimate range to well over 400 villages. And over the next few decades, the Israeli government pursued a policy of Judaization of the space, making it seem that the Jewish population of Israel simply moved into a previously unused and empty land. And now, various writers have raised the concern that the IDF is specifically targeting Palestinian history. So Shri Paradkar, the Toronto Star columnist, employs the concept of scholasticide here to talk about the elimination of the Palestinian universities, museums. So academics raising concerns about this particular type of destruction call it scholasticide and point to three related phenomena: the destruction of Gaza's educational infrastructure, assaults on universities in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as serious harassment and attacks on senior faculty and students supporting Palestine within the Israeli university system. So a uniform feature of this is attacks on universities and schools. Hungary is another example here. And I'm writing this at a time and publishing this at a time when it's very important to explain to people who are rightly upset at elitist hedge funds like Yale, they're taking advantage. And you can see Republican policymakers over a long time doing this, making universities more and more expensive, even the public universities. So you create resentment. Then you call public university professors, call professors Marxists. So then then what you get, and no Marxist could teach at Yale. I mean, it's impossible. It's a private elite university. There's no such thing as a Marxist at Yale. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to denigrate by linking a place like Yale, filled with, which plays a certain role in the class structure of the United States, with Marxism. They're denigrating an egalitarian ideology by connecting it with something that people, genuinely and for good reason resent and dislike. So these and then what happens, as we've seen in India, where they've also gotten through to the private universities, Pratap Mehta, perfectly ordinary liberal, gets actually almost thrown out of the country. I mean, he certainly can't be a professor there, and that's a private university. So that's what's facing us. That's what's going to happen. They're going to defund, or they're going to find ways, like Claudine Gay, that already happened. They're going to go after black faculty just because they're black, as far as I can see, as representations of DEI, which is there to redress. Once you get rid of critical race theory, then it's a study of the practices that lead to racial division. Then you say, why do we need DEI? There's no, so the progression works like that. If you look at other countries, you can see, they're explicitly learning from Hungary, and remember, Hungary actually ejected a university, its best private, from the country. Central European University had to move to Vienna. So the Indian textbooks in India are quite well, let's do some. I want to talk about the very widely used textbook American Pageant, which is still used today. Here's from the 1983 version. The American Republic, which is still relatively young when compared with the Old World, was from the outset richly favored. It started from scratch on a vast and virgin continent, which was so sparsely populated by Indians that they could be eliminated or shouldered aside. Such a magnificent opportunity for a great democratic experiment may never come again, for no other huge, fertile, and relatively uninhabited areas are left in the temperate zones of this crowded planet. In this section entitled Columbus Stumbles Upon a New World, the authors continue representing, well, they go on about how great Columbus is. Then they say, this is another paragraph about how there are only a few indigenous people. They say there was only 1 million indigenous people. The current scholarly estimate is around 72 million indigenous people. So that was off by a bit. So now there's a bunch of, how much more time do I have?
Maybe 15 minutes.
Okay. There's a bunch of, right now you're finding, so in 6 different states so far, PragerU videos have been legalized as educational resources. The PragerU videos are mind-boggling. They have one called Christopher Columbus, Explorer of the New World, where a boy makes the case for Christopher Columbus as an important heroic figure. Columbus was a really courageous guy who loved exploring, inspired generations, and spread Christianity and Western civilization to people who really benefited from new ways of thinking and doing things. And then the girl with whom he's speaking responds, "That sounds really good." And in the rest of the video, the boy and the girl travel back in time to meet a friendly Christopher Columbus, who narrates a heroic account of his life and decries the practice of measuring the actions of his time against future standards of behavior. Remember, of course, that Bartholomew de las Casas was very clear about what was going on at the time. Obviously, you can probably guess what's in mid-20th century textbooks about slavery and Reconstruction. There's a PragerU video called A Short History of Slavery. So this is not 1965 in Virginia. This is now being taught in 6 different states. And the narrative is provided by black far-right commentator Candace Owens. Well, to summarize, she said, we owe to white men the end of slavery. It was only white men who ended slavery. So slavery was a permanent institution, and white men for the world. There's no mention of Haiti, of course. Now, the justification for King Leopold's, he knew it was BS, but the justification for King Leopold's colonization of the Congo was to end the slave trade in Congo. And this is Candace Owens. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value for our ancestors. So this is the kind of attack we're facing in the United States. It's very familiar in other countries. It's the Trump educational plan, central to his 2024 run, and now he has the people to implement it. It's called Save American Education and Give Power Back to Parents. It calls for cutting federal funding for any school or program pushing critical race theory, gender ideology, or other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content onto our children. Create a new credentialing body that will be the gold standard anywhere in the world to certify teachers who embrace patriotic values, support our way of life, and understand that their job is not to indoctrinate children. Fire Department of Education employees deemed radicals, zealots, and Marxists. And then, of course, the anti-trans stuff that is, and this needs to be theorized, it's rigid gender roles. Rigid gender roles are central to fascism. Magnus Hirschfeld's in the Institute for Sexuelle Wissenschaft, the largest collection of LGBT perspectives in the world at the time. Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexuelle Wissenschaft library was one of the three first targets of the May 8th to 10th, 1933 mass book burning in Berlin. And obviously, okay, so Russia, now let's move to the textbooks that Russia is using in Russia and the occupied territories. This is, so Putin, in his infamous speech on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, when I was asked, he says, when I was asked about Russian-Ukrainian relations, I said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. It is what I have said on numerous occasions and what I firmly believe. And Medvedev, Putin's second in command, basically, recently, I think last week or the week before, gave a speech with a map behind him that showed no Ukraine. It showed Kiev Oblast, small, which would be obviously a rump state and Russia's in control of. And then it showed the rest of Ukraine being handed to Romania and Hungary. Which is why actually Orban won such a victory, because he was constantly messaging that Putin was going to give part of Ukraine to Hungary. And so they would finally be able to do Greater Hungary. Okay. None of this is true, of course. Putin calls Ukraine Little Russia. The Russian textbooks, I hired a research assistant who speaks Russian, of course, for this. The Russian textbooks from 21 to 23 represent Russia as entirely innocent, as only ever invading countries to help the separatist movements, the Russian separatist movements. And so it's entirely innocent. Russia takes over the mantle of the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union was not an ethno-nationalist fascist state. It was a different kind of awful state. And so they erase the concepts, they erase Holodomor, they erase Stalin's mass killing. Victoria Amelina, the journalist, I speak in the book with this quote: "The Soviet system never commemorated the Holocaust. One reason for this is that once you define and identify one genocide, you can recognize other genocidal crimes. The Soviet Empire didn't want us to learn our history." And this is in a remarkable piece by her called "Nothing Bad Has Ever Happened." Victoria Amelina was she was leading last summer, I believe, I don't remember exactly what month, she was leading a group of journalists from the global south to the front lines. The Russians bombed the restaurant they were in, killing her, and then at her funeral in Lvov, which the Russians had not bombed for months and months and months, they hit the town square where right outside the church where her funeral was, where just as the people were leaving her funeral, killing 40 to 50 people, including many members of her family. So, Russian textbooks represent Russia as entirely innocent. Hitler devotes a lot of time, a good amount of time in Mein Kampf to civic education and the need for civic education. Here's a quote from Mein Kampf. "Our educational system lacked the art of picking a few names out of the historical development of our people and making them the common property of the whole German people. Thus, through knowledge and like enthusiasm, tying a uniform uniting bond around the entire nation. They did not understand how to make the really significant men of our people appear as outstanding heroes in the eyes of the present, to concentrate the general attention on them and thus create a unified mood." So Hitler is saying that education should take the form of choosing some Aryans in the past, saying they were remarkable great men, praising them, erasing non-Aryans, and just lifting these Aryan men up. And if this sounds a lot like what we're being asked to do in the United States with the Founding Fathers, it's ideologically, at least, not coincidental. And of course, erasing all elements of the past. So I'm going to go on for 2 more minutes, and then yeah.
You have more than 2 minutes.
So one of the chapters is called Classical Education, which is a lengthy discussion of what classical education is. I start with a famous Du Bois quote from Souls of Black Folk about the importance of classical education. I think 2 things you have to recognize is that some of the great, revolutionary intellectuals did think Plato was important. Like Martin Luther King's exam for the social philosophy class, I think he taught at BU, is all about it's a great exam, and I wish I had assigned it, but it's all about Rousseau, Aristotle, and Plato, with great questions about them, like list the radical doctrines in Plato's Republic. And of course, you find like Hillsdale College, they're saying we need a classical education, and that's supposed to be because to preserve the family, to emphasize the importance of God, heterosexual relationships. But in the Republic, Plato, in Callipolis, all the kids the state removes the kids from their families and raises them. No one knows who their kids are. And obviously, in the Symposium, we have great praise of older men grooming boys. But on the other hand, with classical education, the Nazis put so much money into classical education, they funded it as much as physics. So, classical education gets lifted up by fascist regimes. Mussolini, same thing. The idea was Nazi Germany was the natural successor to Rome and Greece. The idea in the United States, of course, is the founding fathers were the natural, they created America as the natural succession to, so this is extremely dangerous. This is personalizing classical history. So I'm going to end just by listing sort of the features, well, okay, instead of doing that. So I identify like 6 features of fascist education. But one of the chapters is called anti-education, because that's, I think, more what's going on in the United States. Fascist education seeks to mobilize. So Russian textbooks now talk about military education, very similar to the Nazi textbooks. The importance of the military, the importance of learning to fight, and Russian greatness. But what's happening, I think, in the United States is a libertarian agenda of simply ending public education and leaving people with nothing. And that's a demobilizing education. That's education to demobilize. It's an education to give people no narrative of the past, of the different perspectives in the past, and just feeling politically hopeless. Obviously, in China, they eliminate from all schools the mention of Tiananmen Square. Any authoritarian movement wants to eliminate the history of social movements. But in the United States, I don't think the big push is to replace it by anything. The big push is just to leave people confused and ignorant. Thank you.